say please. I'm not going to give you the cookies, you say please. I mean, that's pretty typical.
Now, could you please define what you mean by culture?
Okay. Culture is generally defined sociologically by the way people do things and the meanings attributed to what you do. The values, the norms, the behaviors, the assumptions of that culture, of that group of people that are demonstrated through particular behaviors and certain symbols that have certain meanings attributed to them. So, for example, there was some research done that there's universal moral norms. The universal moral norms are purity, authority, fairness, community, and harm. So in other words, every single human society values those 5 things. There's a value on purity. You can understand biologically why we would value purity. Because if you have impure things, impure situations, you could say. Then authority, again, you can understand. What that means is that it's considered in every society a greater moral sin to harm an authority. Just like in America, if you kill a police officer, it's considered a greater crime than if you kill an ordinary citizen. So, you know, to kill your mother is considered more morally heinous than to kill some stranger woman in the street. So this concept that authority should be treated with extra deference, and you can understand again the biological basis for that. We all have a mother and father on whom we're dependent, and to harm the person who's taking care of you would be greater harm than greater moral harm than to harm others. Then fairness. Again, you can understand why there's a concept of fairness. We have an illusion of limited resources. And if we don't have some sort of concept of fairness, then the weaker sections of society are not going to be taken care of. Then community. Every society has some sort of concept that we have to have loyalty to a community over and above our individual needs. And again, you can see the biological basis in that in the fact that there's family. And that the family helps each other, not just individually. And then harm. So every society has some sort of concept that one should not harm others. And again, you can see the rationale for that. That if I don't want to be harmed, it's nice to have a community where there's a moral concept that harm should not be done. So those basic concepts exist in all societies. Now, culture is going to have to do with which ones are emphasized. So some cultures may emphasize fairness over authority. Or authority over community, or the weight that's put on them is going to be very different. Also, the way they're demonstrated will be very different. So the example that I always give is that of how food is served in different parts of the world. So in America, if a guest comes to your house and you say, would you like a chapati? And they say, no, thank you. Then you don't give them one. You don't even ask a second time. You ask once, and if they say no, the way you show respect is you accept them. You don't ask again. And you certainly don't put a chapati on their plate. You know? But in India, you're not even asked. And if you were asked, your answer is ignored, as if you said nothing. And just, you know, things are put on your plate whether you like it or not. And what's interesting is that each culture is trying to be respectful to the guest. But the respect is shown in quite opposite ways. So if somebody who's accustomed to Indian culture comes to America, they're going to be very hungry as a guest. You know, they're not going to get what they want and what they need to eat, because the way that their culture expresses respect is opposite. And if you're from America and you go to India, you know, you're going to get way too much to eat. You're going to get fat. It's quite, but the principle is the same. The principle of having respect and of making sure guests are taken care of is identical, but it's expressed in diametrically opposed ways. So no matter how many times I've been to India and how often I've stayed there and how many times I go to Indians' houses, which is a lot, I'm never comfortable with the way they serve food. I've never been able to feel comfortable with it. But my emotional reaction is that these people are insulting me. That's my emotional reaction to being served food that I don't want, and that I've said that I don't want. Even though I know intellectually that is a completely different culture. So this is one way we can understand what is culture. Culture is, what does something mean? Does putting food on your plate when you said, no, I don't want it, does that mean that you're respectful, or does that mean that you're disrespectful? Well, it depends in what culture you're operating. Another example is there was one of the main airlines of Korea many years ago had one of the highest crash records, one of the lowest safety records. So some investigators found that the reason, that the times when this would happen would be when the pilot was flying rather than the co-pilot. And they studied that the co-pilot would notice some problem, but the co-pilot would not want to be upfront with the pilot about what the problem was. They either would say nothing, or they would just say something very indirect. And if the pilot didn't pick up on it, the co-pilot wouldn't press it. Like, they would continue to be indirect. They were also finding that the pilots, or either the pilots or co-pilots, would not be direct with the control towers. So they would say things to the control tower like, we're running low on fuel. Can we land soon? When actually we only had 5 minutes left of fuel. They wouldn't say, we have 5 minutes left of fuel, we have to land immediately. It would be very indirect. So the way that the problem was solved is that all the pilots and co-pilots, anyone who flew planes for this airline, had to learn English. And because in Korean there's like 10 different ways of saying you, the hierarchical concept is embedded in the language. And by using a different language, they got rid of a lot of this hierarchical concept. And then they also had to retrain the pilots to have a less hierarchical view. So that's still the concept of authority. So it's not that the moral principle of authority is absent in a more egalitarian culture like America. Americans still have a moral value on authority. Otherwise, we wouldn't be more horrified when police officers were killed. But we don't demonstrate it like that. Whereas in very hierarchical cultures, they do. So that's a cultural difference. How do you show respect for authority? I mean, another simple thing, you can see a difference between hierarchical and egalitarian cultures, which is one of the measures sociologists use to measure cultures. Like, I'll sit on the ISKCON when I'm teaching directly from Shastra, but otherwise I don't like to. Because it's not for me, it's for the Shastra. So generally when I speak, I don't like being higher than the audience. I feel very uncomfortable because I'm raised in a very egalitarian culture where it's considered very disrespectful and very bad etiquette to take a symbol of power. To have outward symbols of power like that. You have power, there's power in hierarchy in America, but you're not supposed to make it obvious. But when I'm speaking to people from very hierarchical cultures, they're very uncomfortable when I don't take a symbol of power. And, you know, if I'm in those sort of cultures, I'll take the symbols of power just because I figure my discomfort is less important than their discomfort. But it's quite interesting that I'll see people from hierarchical cultures, they're as uncomfortable when I don't take a symbol of authority as I am when I do take a symbol of authority. So these are cultural things. And we tend to think that our culture, we tend to think that our cultural ways of acting are just the way it is. That we're not even aware that they're cultural. We just think they are what they are. They're self-evident truths to us. And we judge other people's character often by cultural differences without realizing that what we're really looking at is cultural differences. So we may judge somebody as respectful or rude when we're really looking at a problem in culture. I mean, just about the actually yesterday, so I was going through the prasadam line, and the devotee who was serving the halwa, I said, no, I don't want any. I said about 3 times, no, and I moved my plate away. And he took the spoon and he moved forward, you know. And he said, well, I'll just a little bit. And he took just a little bit, and I felt really offended. I'm like, can't he understand that I don't want any? Why can't he just understand that I don't want any? Why is he trying to force me to take something I don't want? But from his perspective, that was his duty. I heard in Japan that you're supposed to say no 4 times. You know? Would you like some water? No, thank you. No, really, would you like some water? No, that's okay. Really, would you like some water? No. Please have some water. Oh, okay. And this is what's expected. Or if someone invites you over for dinner, you're supposed to say, no, I don't want to trouble you. No, I don't want to trouble you. No, I don't want to. All right, just a little rice and a little vegetable. And of course, they make a big feast. You find this in Chaitanya Charitamrita, where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was saying to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, I'll just take a little rice and a little vegetable. And then Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya gives him a whole feast. So this is something about we can understand what is culture. Culture are, first of all, how values are interpreted. So again, every society has a value of purity. But what does that mean? What do we mean by purity? Just like in American society, meat is not understood as impure. So if you ask an American meat eater, you know, would you eat impure things? He'd say, no, of course not. So culture is first of all, what values are how the values are weighted. Which values are more important than others? You know, what's more important, community or fairness, for example? And different cultures are going to put their weights differently. How those values are interpreted, what do they mean? And then what behaviors you do to exemplify those values, and what do those behaviors mean? Also, different cultures have different symbols that have different meanings. Yes?
So this is very interesting because as parents, so we were raised in a very different cultural context.
Oh, yes, you were.
And so I'm actually quite eager to explore this topic of how do you raise children in a completely different culture, right? Like,
well, it's interesting because I wasn't really going to go there.
Okay.
I was going to go in another direction. But that is certainly another very interesting discussion.
We can talk about it some other time.
Well, I have a presentation, not with me, of course, or kind of with me. I have a multimedia presentation that explores, this is something Sayagita and I were talking about yesterday also, that explores the dealings between one's native and alien cultures. But I can just talk about that briefly now before we get into the main topic that I wanted to cover today. But that concept is that every religion has a culture that is native to it. Every religion in the world has a culture that's native to that religion. And you can think of it as the religion is the soul and the culture is the body. In other words, culture is the way in which you express your values, the way in which you express your beliefs. And native culture to a religion is defined as that culture in which the religion either was created or that culture in which the religion came to prominence. So, for example, although Christianity first came to existence in the Middle East, the Middle Eastern culture is not the native culture to Christianity, because Christianity first became powerful in Europe. So European culture is what's native to Christianity, whereas Middle Eastern culture, particularly Arab culture, is what's native to Islam. And one thing we discuss is, well, what culture is native to Vaishnavism, which isn't such an easy question to answer by me. No, it's not. Well, we would all say Vedic culture, but what in the world is that? We don't really know. I haven't met anybody who likes anyone else. It's absolutely a problem.
Why can't we say Hindu?
Would you be willing to say, first of all, there's different cultures in different parts of India. Gujarati culture and Tamil Nadu culture are not exactly the same. No. The other thing is that modern Indian culture, I would not say is Vaishnavism is native culture.
But also your Christianity.
And modern Indian culture also have that problem.
Oh, it is the same as modern European?
No, also it isn't. The European culture that was native to Christianity no longer exists. So we also have that problem. And if you just look at what's happening in India today and say, well, that's the culture that's native to Christian consciousness, I don't think you'll be correct. But certainly of all the cultures in the world, Indian culture represents a culture that's the most native to Christian consciousness. In the sense that you can walk in a sari and tilak and chanting in pretty much any part of India, even in modern cities. And it's not that peculiar. But even modern India is not so much. And then every other culture is an alien culture. And every other local culture is an alien culture which is native to another religion or another philosophy. And then we also have, right now in the world, globally, two cultures that are alien to all religions. We have a positivistic culture and a post-positivistic culture, also called modern and postmodern. But I don't like to use those words because people think they're referred to certain time periods and they don't. Positivistic culture is the culture of secularism or atheism that says there's an objective truth, and that objective truth is understood through mathematics and physics, and that objective truth can be understood through sense perception and logic. That is positivism. And post-positivism says there is no objective truth at all. It is absolutely true that there's no absolute truth. That is post-positivism. And rather everybody simply creates their own truth. All cultures, all people create their own truth, and one truth is not better than another. Of course, they don't totally believe that. It's not the post-positivists really believe that a cannibalistic culture or a Nazi culture is no better than any other. But that's their philosophy. So then we have those two alien cultures that are all over the world. So in the modern time, every religious community has the challenge of how to bring up their children. Do they bring up their children not only in their religion, but in the culture that is native to their religion? Do they bring up their children in their religion, but in the local alien culture? Do they bring up their children in their religion, but in the positivistic or post-positivistic culture, which is highly antagonistic to religion? At least other local cultures are native to some religion. American culture is native to Protestant Christianity. American culture supports Christianity. Or do you have some other relationships? So that's another seminar to discuss that. And Sankirtan and I were talking about this, as to what extent a Gurukula should be simply promoting what we understand as our own native culture, however poorly we understand it. Or should the Gurukula be teaching Krishna consciousness while at the same time teaching the local alien culture?
What's the kind of alien?
It's alien to Krishna consciousness. India is an alien culture to Christianity.
Although
Indian culture does not support Christianity.
Although Christianity is very, especially South India, is very prominent because of the
Yeah, well, it's starting modern India because the secular culture is spreading all over the world. It's very hard to go to places where the local culture fully supports a particular religion. You'll find that, in the Muslim countries, some of the Muslim countries, where they've kept very intentionally so, they've kept their local culture so it strongly supports Islam. I mean, this is a big struggle they're having in Israel as to whether or not they want their local culture to be highly supported in Judaism. It's one of the big struggles that they're having in Israel. Because positivistic and post-positivistic secular cultures are highly antagonistic to all religions. they're highly antagonistic to theism, and Srila Prabhupada preached extensively against both positivism and post-positivism. But if you're going to try to raise your children in both Krishna consciousness philosophy and a positivistic culture or a post-positivistic culture, you really have a problem. Because you're doing things that are strongly opposed to each other.
Like training children at home in Krishna consciousness, but when you're sending them to schools that teach positivism.
It's not just that they teach it, it's that the whole atmosphere is permeated with it.
Right. So that's a clear challenge right there.
It's a different challenge. I mean, you basically have, again, this is really another seminar that I'm getting into. And usually I have a lot of visuals and charts because this is very complicated concepts. I'm trying to just teach verbally. Probably a lot of you are going, what in the world is she talking about? Because I usually have a lot of support service.
What is the positivism and positivism?
Positivism is what you call empirical science.
Oh.
Positivism is, there's an objective truth that is mathematical and scientific. There's an objective truth that's separate from our perceptions of it, that exists separately from our perceptions of it. There is objective truth that where our perceptions of it are irrelevant to its existence and its definition. And the way we understand that objective truth, am I boring half of you? The way we understand that objective truth is through our sense perception and logic. That is positivism. Basically what we call empirical science, the hard empirical sciences. Mathematics, chemistry, physics, is based on the positivistic, or modernistic, sometimes it's called, philosophy. And post-positivism says there is no objective truth separate from our perception of it. That truth exists only relative to our perception of it. Do you understand the difference?
There's growing number of agnostics.
Agnosticism is definitely related to post-positivism, because post-positivism says there is no objective truth. That truth is understood only in terms of our perception of it. There isn't an objective truth separate from our perception. And how can you say that one person's perception is better than another? Then if there's no objective truth separate from perception, then why is one type of perception more valid than another type of perception? And this is the whole trend towards, which is a lovely trend in many ways, towards acceptance of multiculturalism, for example, which definitely benefits us as devotees, is based on a post-positivistic or postmodernistic philosophy. It's a yatamat tatapat philosophy. Whatever you do, it doesn't matter. Everything is equally good. But both of those are highly opposed to theism. So the positivistic view says there is no God. Or God is a mathematical formula. You know, there is no God in the sense of a supreme being. The objective truth is not personal. Nor is the objective truth living. The objective truth is inorganic and impersonal. So that's very opposed to theism. Post-positivism would accept the idea of a God. But that's just your opinion. So you can have the opinion that there's a God, that's fine. But everybody else can have their own opinion, and that's also fine. And your opinion isn't any better than anybody else's opinion. So post-positivism very much allows for religious plurality, but it's against the concept of religion in general, and it's certainly against any sort of preaching. In positivism, you could preach because you could say, hey, I found the objective truth. And if it's objective truth, you should be able to tell others. Whereas post-positivism, why should I be able to tell you my perception of truth? Why is my perception of truth better than your perception of truth? It isn't. And both of those trends are very strong in what we would call the global secular system. Secular means that you interpret the world without reference to God. So anyway, we do have a challenge. We do have a challenge as to what culture do we bring up our children in. Do we try to have them be devotees in terms of philosophy, but culturally be American? Do you say no? But it's a question. Or do you want them to be both philosophically Krishna conscious and culturally Indian, or culturally French, or culturally something else? But the real problem is that we're not just dealing with American culture, we're dealing with this global secular culture, which is quite different from what was American culture. Not the same thing. The American Christians are just as much as upset about the global secular culture as we are. You understand?
Could you please say that
the American Christians are just as disturbed and upset about the global secular culture as we are.
Really? That's why they started homeschooling.
Exactly. The Orthodox American Jews, the strict Muslims, I mean, anyone of any religious faith is just as upset and worried and concerned about the global secular culture as we are, because it's antagonistic to all religions. So what's very difficult, if not nearly impossible, is to raise your children as Krishna devotees and yet have them culturally be the part of the positivistic culture or the post-positivistic culture. That's almost impossible, because they're diametrically opposed to each other. The way that meaning and value is interpreted is opposite. Does that make sense to everybody? Are you following me? This is very complicated academic stuff, so I'm not sure if anybody's following me. Yeah.
Would it be really possible to keep the culture aside and just focus on, like consciousness?
That's a very good question. I remember in one of my doctoral classes, the professor says, is it possible to live without culture? What's your answer to that question? Could anyone be acultural? Could anybody have no culture?
I mean, that's why the animals. But the animals have their own culture?
Yes, they do actually.
So they have to.
That would be like an avadhuta.
like acting from the soul?
You'd be an avadhuta. You'd be outside of society, completely outside of society. Like you have Rishabdev in the end of his life, Maharaj Yudhisthira in the end of his life, Jad Bharat. They were examples of people who were outside culture.
Is that who you hear?
I don't think so.
But for a child, because
But remember, culture is how you express your values. It's the way in which you express your values. And so is it possible to have a philosophy and values, but no particular way of expressing them? I don't think so. Unless you're like an avadhuta who does not express them. So Jad Bharata did not express his values and his philosophy externally at all. And you know, those persons who lived as avadhutas, they were outside of culture. And they were culturally rejected. And they were abused by their, I think abusive would be an accurate term there. They were abused by their contemporaries. Even though Rishabdev had been the emperor after he lived as an avadhuta. One of Dhruva Maharaj's sons, Urmila, also lived like that. Yes. By the way, this is not usually where I take this seminar. I'm going in a very different direction. Is this okay with everybody? Cool with this, or are you only getting impatient? Yes.
Could you explain how you said this? You said something about the secular culture and our culture is opposite in the way.
It's completely opposite.
But you said something about opposite in the way values are acceptable.
Yeah. Secularism means, the definition of secular is I understand, interpret, explain everything without reference to God, without reference to religion. There's a tornado and nobody talks about God. Whatever happens in the world is everything is explained without reference to anything spiritual or supernatural. Everything is understood. The lens through which you view and understand and makes your sense-making mechanism doesn't have any reference to anything spiritual. And the rituals of the society, the symbols of the society, the stories of the society, the main way culture is transmitted is through things like stories, heroes and villains, symbols, are without reference to God. So that's what secularism means. On a cultural level, it means the symbols, the main symbols of the culture and the rituals of the culture have no reference to God. And on an individual level, it means an individual interprets their life without reference to God. Why things happen, what things mean, whether things are good or bad, is interpreted in some way other. It's interpreted in terms of evolution, or psychology, or something like that, or chemistry and physics, or social theories. I mean, pick up the New York Times and read any editorial, or any, and you'll find that there's so many explanations given of why things are happening and why people act the way they do, and never, ever, ever, ever is anything theological brought into the picture. There's no theological explanation ever given for anything. There's no theological explanation ever given for why we should behave in a certain way. So that's secular. That's a secular culture. And there's two varieties of it. And there's the positivistic variety and the post-positivistic variety. Post-positivism is relatively new. Positivism is the concept that there's one objective truth, and that objective truth is material. And that objective truth, and that there's a truth that exists outside of our perception of it, and that truth can be understood through sense perception and through logic. It can't be understood through prayer, it can't be understood through meditation, it can't be understood through revelation. It can only be understood through sense perception and logic. And everybody should be able to understand that truth in exactly the same way, because it's an objective truth that exists outside of people's perception. That's positivism, also called modernism. Post-positivism or postmodernism says there is no objective truth outside of perception, but truth is a function of perception. And therefore there's many ways to know truth. You could know truth through meditation and revelation, why not? You could know truth in so many different ways. Who's to say that one way of knowing truth is better than another, or that one truth is better than another? That's post-positivism. Is that clear? So there, I don't see any way that you could raise your child in a secular culture and in Krishna consciousness. I think that is impossible. I see that it's just completely impossible by definition. You couldn't do it. Just can't do it. In order to raise your children, in order to raise a child as a religious person, then you have to raise them in a culture that supports a religious concept. Now, most local cultures, most non-global secular cultures, do support a particular religion. I mean, the idea of culture supporting a religion, just like most people don't work on Sunday, and everything's closed on Christmas. So if you're a Christian, you have support from the culture. If you want to run for political office and you talk about Jesus, you can still get elected. Yes? It's not that you're not, even though we're very much affected by the global secular culture. Still, politicians can talk about Jesus and get elected. I mean, we now just elected Tulsi Gabbard, and she's a devotee of Krishna, although she presents herself as a Hindu. But she's not so much talking about Krishna. You know, if you wanted to get elected and you were talking about some other religion, it might not work. But there's support for one particular religion. So if you want to be a Christian in America, you have a lot of support from the culture. If you want to be a different religion in America, you don't get as much support from the culture. Does that make sense? If we had a culture that really supported Krishna consciousness, then everything would be closed on Ekadasi. Well, just like around Alachua, where there's so many devotees, there's such a big community of devotees. So I haven't been there for a long time. But I've been told that the local grocery stores they know when the Ekadasi is. And they have stuff in the store. Yeah, they have stuff in the store that's marked for Ekadasi.
Where is it?
In Ledgewood, in Gainesville.
Oh.
Because there's so many devotees there. So, they'll, right before every Ekadasi, they'll have signs up by certain produce and products that will say suitable for Ekadasi, suitable for Ekadasi. Well, it's just like if there's a Jewish neighborhood, then you have a lot of things that'll be marked as kosher. And if you have a Muslim neighborhood, lots of things marked as halal, right? It's the same principle. So what many of us try to do is we try to form little neighborhoods and communities where we create our own little, close to as possible native culture that supports our religion. This is the principle behind devotees wanting to start their own farms and devote the whole city of Mayapur, where you create your own culture, your own culture is what you're trying to create. You're trying to create a small area where you have your native culture. Again, you see this in neighborhoods in the big cities, yes? There'll be the Orthodox Jewish neighborhood and there'll be the Muslim neighborhood. All right. So does everyone have a much clearer idea now? Again, I've never done this before the seminar. I'm sorry I didn't record it. I'm making a hard Krishna. Does anyone have a much clearer idea now what we mean by culture? So of course what we're looking at today will also include philosophy, but we're focusing on culture. How do children learn culture? And there is a question, which I'm not going to try to answer today at all, but there is a question as to what culture should we raise our children in. There is that question, and I guess I'll say a little bit more about it since I brought it up. You asked about it. There's basically three approaches when you're living in an alien culture, which we are. We're living in a culture, American culture is alien to Krishna consciousness. So and right now everybody's dealing with alien culture. You cannot get away from alien culture because the global secular culture is everywhere. So even if you go to India, global secular culture is there, yes? It's there everywhere. I mean, that place like Saudi Arabia, they're really trying to keep it out. Or Burma, they're really, they're just trying to put up a wall against these two global secular cultures. And they're moderately successful. They're certainly not entirely successful. Or you think in say, Mayapur, we have a wall around the property, and we're trying to create our own little ghetto, really, where we keep out the global secular culture. And again, we're moderately successful. We're not entirely successful. So there's three ways that a religion can deal with alien cultures. One is to be exclusive and aggressive and say, we're not going to deal with the alien culture at all. So we certainly have devotees like this. We're going to shut ourselves off from the outside alien cultures. We're not going to deal with it at all. We're just going to go out to shop or to preach. We're going to be completely insulated. And then the opposite is, we're going to accept almost everything from the alien culture, but we'll be Krishna conscious anyway. We'll be devotees, but culturally speaking, we'll be just like the local alien culture. We'll be devotees, but we'll get Christmas trees, and we'll adopt the externals of the alien culture. We'll have kirtans with guitars. I didn't say any of these were right or wrong. I'm saying that there's three ways of dealing with them. That's called a relativistic or synchronistic approach, where you just say that our religion can be expressed, our philosophy can be expressed in any culture. And then there's what's called the dialogic approach, where you say, well, let's look at the alien culture. Which parts of it can we use and which parts of it can't we use? And you have a dialogue with the alien culture. So all three of those ways have pros and cons. None of them are perfect.
Sorry, what is the third?
Dialogic.
Taking just things which are...
Well, you're in a dialogue with the culture. You try to give things of value to that culture, and you're willing to take things of value from that culture.
So mutual.
It's a mutual exchange. So the benefit of the exclusive approach is that you have a very strong identity. You have a very, very strong identity. Identity is also understood as your distinction from others. So you have a strong sense of identity because you have a strong sense of not only who you are, but how you're different from others. And in the exclusive approach, you get a lot of positive energy from your culture because you've surrounded yourself with a native culture. The downside of the exclusive approach is that you can't function in the outside culture. And if you try to function in the outside culture, you become schizoid. You'll be one person when you'll either be religious or you'll either be following your religion or you'll be like somebody else, like you have two personalities. Because the exclusive approach says, I cannot be a devotee except in my own culture. That's the exclusive approach. That's the exclusive philosophy is, I can only be a devotee in my own culture. I can't be a real devotee, in any other culture. It can't be real bhajan unless it's, a claim redanga. That's the exclusive approach. And if such a person has to deal with the outside culture, they can't be Krishna conscious in the outside culture. They're philosophically, they can't. Do you follow what I'm saying? So that's the exclusive approach. It says, I can only be Krishna conscious in my own culture. As soon as I take up other cultures, what I'm doing is no longer authentically Krishna conscious. So such a person, either they have to sacrifice their Krishna consciousness, or they have to sacrifice their ability to work in the outside culture, or they have to be like two separate people. Two different identities, and they switch back and forth between them. So that's the downside of the exclusive approach. The relativistic synchronistic approach, on the positive side, you can function anywhere. Because you're saying in the relativistic synchronistic approach that my philosophy and religion is totally independent of culture. It can be expressed in any culture. So you can blend in anywhere, work anywhere, be anywhere. On the negative side, you may lose your identity. You may lose your philosophy, you may lose your identity. Because every culture has a philosophy attached to it. So to say that I'm going to accept the externals of another culture, but I'm going to substitute my philosophy into it, may not always work that well. Because that culture was designed around another philosophy. Then the dialogic one is a lot of what a lot of people assume would be ideal. But on the positive side of the dialogic approach, you should have both strong identity and strong ability to function in alien cultures. But the downside is it requires a lot of work and thought. And that might sound like a positive, but it doesn't seem to be one for most people. When you speak in an organization. It requires a tremendous amount of work and thought because you're saying, well, this can be accepted and this can't. And there's going to be a lot of disagreement. One person will say these things can be accepted, another person will say these things, right? You're having a lot of arguments then about what's a principle and what's a detail. And you can end up with neither. You can end up with a weak identity and a weak ability to function in it. You can end up with, instead of having the best parts of both, you can end up with the worst parts of both. So each of them has their difficulties. My own personal suggestion is that you move on that continuum. That in certain things you're exclusive, and at certain times you're exclusive, and in certain times and ways you're relativistic, and in certain times and ways you're dialogic. That's my own suggestion.
So flexibility.
Flexibility, because none of those gives you all positives. So anyway, these are also big questions about how to raise our children. And you see some devotees take a very exclusive, aggressive approach towards alien cultures. We still have devotees who do things like this. Years ago at ISKCON, that was the norm for everybody. Years ago in ISKCON, the exclusive, aggressive approach was the ISKCON norm. We were very cloistered. We did not interact much with outside society, and we did not bring up our children in ways where they could interact with the outside culture. Nor were we particularly clear about what our own culture was, unfortunately. And now you'll see everything. So you'll see people who are bringing up their children in a relativistic, synchronistic way. You'll see their children, people bringing up their children in an exclusive, aggressive way, and you'll see people bringing up their children in biological. And occasionally you see people who really try to move on the continuum and be flexible. And that's, of course, the hardest thing to do. It's always like that. The best things usually cost the most money to do. Occasionally, I suppose, it won't sound. All right, is that an entirely different topic than I wanted to cover? If you find this really bewildering, but you're really interested in it, I do have material on this that make it much clearer than my trying to give some way of it without visuals. It doesn't lend itself well to a summary without visuals. It's very common.
Is the core, like of all the three approaches, should the focus be more on strengthening our identity in our culture? Because once that is strong, then...
Well, our identity is I'm a devotee of Krishna. But again, the culture is again how you express that.
Yeah.
What does it look like externally?
So you cannot separate the two.
You can't. I mean, one of my more interesting experiences was, I don't know if we're going to get time to talk about everything else in the depth that I would like to, by the way. One of my more, is this interesting to everybody? Is this useful?
I think we can be flexible on the timing.
To a point.
Different cultures.
To a point. Yes, that is also very cultural. That is also, that there, okay, there you have another good example. I use that as an example also. That's another example of respect, where again you have different cultures who have this idea of being respectful and considerate. So in some cultures, the way you demonstrate respect and consideration is if you say you're going to be there at 2, you're there at 2. And in some cultures, to be respectful and considerate, if you say you're going to be there at 2, you're there sometime in the afternoon. Right? I had an interesting experience recently where I was scheduled to give a class at 8 o'clock at night. So it was, we were staying nearby, it was like 10 to 8, so I finished up what I was doing. You know, we got in the car, and as we got in the car, we got a phone call, and someone said, oh, don't bring Urmila there now, because everybody won't be there. She'll get there too early. And I said, well, I'm not going to go back up to the room. I said, I'm already in the car, I'm already ready. I said, let's just go. I said, let's just go, and if the people aren't there yet, then we can chant or we can read or whatever until they come. It's not a problem. So the other people in the car were very disturbed, but anyway, I wasn't going to go back up to the room. So they went to the location. We got there at 8, and of course nobody was there. So I just sat and was reading, waiting for everybody to come. And as everybody's coming, they're seeing me sitting there reading, you know. And the program started probably about 8:45. And then the people who drove me, they said, you know, Urmila, the organizers were really, really upset. I said, why? I said, they were upset with me. They said, no, they were upset with us that we brought you there early. I said, it wasn't early, it was on time. They said, yeah, but they were really upset that you were there 45 minutes before the program started. I said, why? They said, well, in our culture, the senior can never wait for the juniors. The juniors have to wait for the seniors. So we disrespected you by having to wait for the juniors. I said, oh, okay. So the next day, I was intentionally late. No, what's really funny is because I'd been on time the day before, the message had gotten indirectly communicated to everybody that things were going to start on time. So the next day, everybody showed up on time. And I came in half an hour late. And I came in, the reason that I was intentionally late the next night is I didn't want to cause cultural distress to the people. I thought if this is going to cause them, you know, psychological distress by their cultural upbringing. Because then they're feeling, oh, we've offended her, we've offended her. I didn't feel offended at all, because I have a different culture. So that's a good example. So the principle of not offending someone and the principle of being respectful, the principle of being considerate is exactly the same. But for me, as an American, my concept is if I'm the speaker, I'm supposed to show up on time. That's how I respect my audience. It actually is quite interesting, though, this idea of that juniors should wait for the seniors. We have that concept. That's everywhere in the world. And that's one way people demonstrate that they're an authority. Is that they'll make you wait, and you have to be willing to wait. Government offices will make you wait. Doctors will make you wait. Yes? You'll only wait for someone who's more important than you. Yes? Yes? It's a symbolic way of communicating authority. But see, from my perspective, I don't want to symbolically communicate that I'm an authority. It's not my interest. Yes?
So, what culture we follow, hearing from you, Tati, is that what culture we follow really depends on our nature, what comfort, where we are comfortable with,
and that's going to depend on how you were raised. A lot of that's being communicated now. It's communicated at a very young age. We're going to talk about how it's communicated.
I'm confused about because the way I was raised, many cultural things I was raised with, and when I came to know about certain other things, and I felt that for my personality, this is what I'm comfortable with. For example, say having my own space. Right? Like in my family, if I go visit my parents, and if I go tell my mom, I need some space, I need some time, she'll be like,
what are you talking about?
But that's not how I raised 24 years of my whole lifetime. But then knowing about this part of the culture,
and you're seeing some benefits.
Benefits of,
Well, each of them has their benefits.
So it appears to me that
having no personal space has its benefits. No concept of personal space has its benefits. In cultures where there's no concept of personal space, people are a lot more hospitable. If I have no personal space, if there's no meaning to the terms personal space, then having a guest come in my house and stay in my house and sleeping in my bed and eating my food is fine, because I don't have any personal space. The downside is, you're practically knocked over as you walk through the marketplace because there's no personal space. You follow? You're lucky that you come out alive because there was no personal space. And nobody thought anything whatsoever of literally pushing you aside to get where they were going. And that wasn't interpreted as rude. It wasn't, the person who pushed you never thought in a million years that they were doing something rude, because there's no such thing as personal space, doesn't exist.
Really? I thought they just said the word rude.
No, not at all. See, that's what happens. What happens is because we have a particular cultural concept, which gets transmitted at a very, very young age, and very subtly, and it gets very deep in us.
But it can be changed, right? Like
This
change for me was really a tough one, but I did change.
Not totally. I bet you it's not totally.
It's not easy.
I'm still bothered. I was still bothered by that man who kept trying to serve me hollow. It was very hard for me to see him as being respectful and that he was actually acting. It was very hard for me to interpret his behavior as respectful and considerate. It was very, very difficult. And almost impossible. And I've been exposed to that other culture for decades now. Some of the stuff is very, very deeply ingrained. But do keep in mind that the concept of personal space has its downside also. Everybody has their own little separate place. It's very isolating. It's a very lonely culture. The concept of personal space being very important and even existing, that there is such a thing as personal space, is very isolating. Now, if we're accustomed to that, then we like even some of the isolation. There was, when my son was running a prasadam business, there was a woman from India who came to work in the business, And when they picked her up at the airport and they were driving her to where she was staying, she said, "Where are the people? Aren't there any people?" So you can go to the large, once you're out of the center of the city, there's often nobody walking on the street. Yes? People are very isolated. Everyone's in their own little house, and then they get in their own little car, and then they go to their own little cubicle. Yes? Yes? And then they go back in their own little car, and go back in their own little house. And even in the house, there's one person's room, another person's room. That person has their own television, that person has, yes. I mean, now we're at the point where people are sitting in the same room and they're all in their own little personal space with their own little virtual, isn't it? So in cultures that don't have a concept of personal space, well, they don't even know what you're talking about. If you say you want personal space, they're like, you want what? What do you mean? They can't even translate it.
Right.
For what? What would you do with it? Huh? And but the positive side is that you have community. You don't have this loneliness and this isolation. You have community. And people are into other people's business. Yes? Yes?
Some people wonder how there can be such a great degree of community in, say, Indian villages, because around 7 o'clock at night, everybody gets together for bhajans till 11 midnight. And it seems like no one is ever alone.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the problems we face in ISKCON is we will often try to start communities. And I don't think we do this so much anymore, but we would try to start communities where things were communal and where everybody knew everybody else's business as a way of ensuring high standards. That in order to have high standards, everybody should know what everybody's doing. And that way everybody's going to follow the principles, etc., etc. But if you come from a culture with high personal space, you're going to resist that sort of arrangement. You're going to resist it very strongly. So it's been mostly a failure. Because those of us raised in a culture of high personal space and isolation, we don't really want to live in a fishbowl where everybody knows what everybody else is doing and everybody's in everybody's space and everybody's sharing everything. It's very uncomfortable for us to live in that situation.
Why is it that ISKCON is centered or that they want to have more
Mostly it's to ensure purity.
communal?
It also helps economically.
Yeah.
Just like why is marriage much more economical than divorce? Divorce makes people poor. You know.
Sharing resources.
Yes. In a marriage, the two adults are both contributing to the same household. And in divorce, they're having to maintain two separate households. So there's a direct correlation between divorce and poverty, especially for the woman generally. So the tradition was there was an extended family sharing, and whenever you're sharing your resources, you have more wealth. You have higher standards of living. So that's what's one reason. One reason is that it's much more economical to have shared resources. And the other reason is that it's a lot easier to, how do you say it politely, police people and make sure that people are following, that if everybody's in their own space. But people who come from cultures where there's a lot of personal space resist communal arrangements. They resist extended family. And they resist any kind of communal living. It's uncomfortable for them. It's hard for them to be in a situation like that long term.
I thought Bhaktivinoda Thakur had a very, very nice formula, even though he had something like 13 children. Whenever he wanted to study, meditate, chant, write, he locked himself in a room for 5-6 hours and no one could break in there.
Yeah, well, usually that was from like midnight until 4 in the morning. Which is what Srila Prabhupada also did. Prabhupada did his writing early in the morning. All right. So now that we've had an extended talk about culture in general, I hope it was interesting to everyone. This discussion is much more a sociological one. And it highlights some of the challenges that we have as a very international society. We are an international society for Krishna consciousness, and a lot of the challenges we face is that we have people who are from all different cultural backgrounds. So the more multicultural the center is, the more you're going to have these sort of misunderstandings and conflicts. You're going to label people as rude or inconsiderate or this or that or the other thing, when really what you're looking at is cultural differences. So that's a real challenge in international. We're a very international society. Some places more than others. You can go to some places where everybody's from the same culture. And this also brings up the question, which we're not trying to answer today, but we're just simply bringing up the fact that when we talk about training our children in culture, we do have to question what kind of relationship we want with the alien culture. Are we going to have an exclusively Western relationship, or a relativistic, synchronistic, or a dialogic relationship, or are we going to move on and continue? All right, and looking at how we transmit culture to our children, what are the mechanisms for getting our children to know our culture and to love our culture and to want to be a part of our culture? Now, this is, again, we're not going to try to answer the question of what in the world is our culture. I'm not going to pretend that I can answer that question. I don't think I even know the answer to that question. Is that clear to everyone? If someone says, well, our culture is Vedic culture, I'd say, well, what's that?
Right.
What does it look like? I don't believe anybody walking around today knows what that looks like. You know, is it Indian culture? Again, you have the question of what Indian culture? Bengali culture? Kerala culture? Culture right now in 2013, the culture in 1813. Which Indian culture? I mean, for example, but Srila Prabhupada taught us many things which we don't see in India very much. It was shocking to me. I mean, Srila Prabhupada came and criticized Western uncleanliness. And you expect to go to India and find a very clean culture. It's not. It's really, so I find Western culture on the whole much cleaner than Indian culture. But that's, so what culture? And then we have, of course, our ISKCON culture. We have an ISKCON, are aware that we have an ISKCON culture? Yes? You are all aware that we have an ISKCON culture. We do have an ISKCON culture. We have certain ways of talking and certain ways of behaving and certain symbols that are unique to ISKCON, that are not particularly Indian either. I will say Indians will, they have different cultural practices, and after they're ISKCONized for a while, they'll change their cultural practices. Just like I see in India at most temples, a family will come and sit together. The husband and wife will not sit in separate parts of the temple, they'll sit together. And we have a different, we train them differently. Yes? And we have a whole, what I call a humility culture in ISKCON. Which we can talk about, but not today. So, what culture? I don't know. I'm not sure. But how do we do it? How do we transmit this thing that we're not sure what it is? I think we shouldn't talk about it, but we will anyway. So you presented a very good realizations from your own childhood about how culture was transmitted. And we're going to look at 4 main categories. And these 4 ways that culture is transmitted is so powerful that any one of them, if they exist, is powerful enough to train children in that culture. And as we were talking about culture, I'm sure you understood how deep this stuff is and how unconscious it is. It really becomes a part of you. And it's very, very, very difficult to change the lens of your culture. It's possible, but it's difficult. Something you have, yes? Like you said, it was very difficult for you. Yeah, that's something you really have to work at. And I wonder how much it actually changes. I really wonder. Because I had some circumstance in my own life where the way I was brought up as a child was very different in a certain way as to how I was living in ISKCON. And now that some circumstances in my life have changed, I've had the freedom to go back, and I found that I gradually went back. And basically, I was raised by a family where quality of things was more important than price. And then in ISKCON, I was put in a culture where price was more important. And it was extreme. I mean, it was really extreme. My husband and I used to do the shopping for the temple, and he would drive 20 minutes further just to save a penny per cup. I couldn't fathom that. I just didn't make sense to me. I couldn't relate to it. And gradually I became steeped in that culture. But for various reasons, I'm no longer having to do that. Basically, I'm in the bottom crust ashram, I don't have to do that. So I've gradually gone back to this concept of quality. And if I can't get something, if I can't afford something quality, then I'd rather have nothing. But it was quite, what I saw was that my cultural, it didn't actually go away. I thought it had gone away. I actually thought I had changed my culture. I really believed that I had changed my culture. I thought, wow, I've completely changed my culture. You know, I used to buy stuff at secondhand stores, and my parents would visit, and I'm like, don't tell them it's from a secondhand store. But I didn't really change. When my circumstances shifted, I went back to how I was raised. Do you understand that? So I'm not sure how much people really change their culture.
And so what I was trying to share was it's more like feeling out of hurt, and like more of that made me choose certain circumstances,
Maybe. But I really wonder if you were to go back and be in that other circumstance again, would you end up? It's just a wonder. Would you end up going back and saying, "Oh, this is actually no more comfortable"? Anyway, that's what I've seen in myself, and it surprised me tremendously that I remain more comfortable in the culture of my childhood.
Interesting.
That I really have not changed my culture. And I thought I did, but I didn't. And I've also noticed this with myself, because I travel all over the world, that I basically have an American culture. And I can't pretend to have another culture. Not very well. I think of it like dyeing your hair. You know, it always looks funny, and the roots always show. And if you try to act like you're another culture, it just doesn't. It doesn't work. So that's what I've seen, at least in myself. And I found it sort of fascinating, because I really, really thought that culturally I had changed. But I don't think I have. And I concluded it's extremely difficult. It's probably possible. And I lived culturally differently for decades, and actually believed I had changed my culture. But at the core, I hadn't. So just a thought. I mean, this is perhaps one of the reasons why how we educate children is so important. Because how you're trained as a child really is how you're the most comfortable. Full stop, end of story. You know, that the philosophy and the culture of your childhood is always going to be the situation where you're going to feel most comfortable. Even if for various reasons you try to live in a completely different situation. And even feel that you've adapted, and even feel that you've become somebody else, and you become something else. Prabhupada talks about children as being soft dough, and they can be molded in any way. And I've always taken the analogy a little further and said, well, children get to a certain age where the dough gets baked. And then if you want to change someone, you have to break them. You know, you can't remold them anymore.
So what is the time when it gets baked?
Well, what Coach Chanika Pandit is saying, that was 16. That after 16, you have to deal with your child as a friend, which I understand that to mean you can't mold them against their will anymore. Children are being molded whether they like it or not. You're deciding what he gets to see and play with and what he doesn't. He doesn't really have a say in it. And even if he has a say, you have the ultimate decision. So until a child's 16, to a large extent, you can mold them even without their conscious agreement. But after 16, that's very difficult. After 16, you can only mold a person in the way, like you would any other adult. I mean, it's interesting about changing culture because I'm sure that anyone would look at me externally and say that I've radically changed my culture.
Externally.
But looking at superficial things. Like I wear a sari, you know, almost 365 days a year, for example. You know, I eat only vegetarian food offered to Krishna. I eat with my fingers, I only sit on the floor. Those sort of things I do. You follow? But there's a lot of deep cultural stuff around. It doesn't matter how long I'm in the movement, it doesn't matter how much I travel out of America. Isn't that interesting? And the more I've studied these kind of things, the more I become aware that and it happens when you're quite young. It's not happens when you're very young. And it happens mostly on an unconscious level. Very, very few people are aware of their cultural biases. We just think that that's the way it is, and that's, of course, that to us is a self-evident truth. That's absolutely. All right, I want to go, otherwise I'm going to have time to talk. So, a lot of people think that the main way we transmit our culture to our children is through example. Now, that's certainly still true, but it's not nearly as true as it used to be. So we talked a lot about this global secular culture, the positivistic and post-positivistic secular culture. That's a fairly recent thing. And how has the global secular culture been spread, by the way? Through the media. So if you go back before there was media, which isn't that long ago, I mean, it was when I was 3 that we got our first TV, and it was black and white, and there were only 3 stations, and we only broadcast a few hours a day, and that was in New York City. You know, we got our first color TV when I was probably 7. And all the programming was live. So the media is a fairly recent thing. You know, you start going back 70, 80 years. Also, people didn't travel much. When I was 3 and we traveled to Israel, we took a propeller plane across the Atlantic. I mean, people simply did not travel that much. There wasn't that much communication. When my sister lived in Israel, it was very difficult to call her. There weren't transatlantic phone lines. And so we bought a tape recorder, and they had a tape recorder, and we would record a message to her and mail it, and then she would play it on her tape recorder, and then she would record a message and mail it back to us. So we're talking, you know, like 45, 50 years ago. It's not that long ago. So you start going back 70, 80 years, and there was very little interaction between cultures, except in maybe some places like New York and London. But most people were very culturally insulated. So wherever you stayed, pretty much everybody had the same culture. What your parents were teaching you was what everybody else was teaching. Everybody was acting the same way. children didn't really grow up with a lot of counterexamples. So example was enough because someone said imitation. You said imitation. Our children naturally imitate. Well, if everybody is acting according to the same culture, then imitation is sufficient. An example is sufficient, isn't it? That is not true anymore. So I think we can say almost every child in the world is exposed to cultures other than what they're familiar with. You're saying this global secular culture, positivistic, post-positive, it's all over the world. It's in Himalayan villages. You know, there's nowhere you're going to go, almost nowhere you're going to go, where you're going to get away from it. Therefore, example isn't enough, because there's so many examples. So the parents will set an example, and somebody else will set another example. Somebody else will set another example. Somebody else will set another example. And on the TV, there's all sorts of examples. You know, and we used to, you know, when I was running Gurukuls, we had rules: no commercial television. I don't know what we would do today. You know, and people used to say to me, how do I deal with television? I say, well, you go to the back, and there's a cord, and you follow it to the wall, and you pull. You know, but you can't say that anymore, because everybody has their own little thing in their pocket. Yes?
Yeah.
It's not so simple anymore. And there's so many different examples of how people are talking. How people are talking is amazing. I still can't believe how people talk to each other nowadays. Sewage comes out of your mouth. Isn't it? So in other words, example isn't enough. You cannot find it, you can't make a bubble anymore. You can't. I know of places in the Hare Krishna world where devotees still try to make bubbles for their children to live in. It's not working. Whether or not you want to say that's a good system or a bad system, the fact is you can't even do it. So even if you think it's good and you want to do it and you want to do it, you can't do it. And we're a preaching movement. How are you going to make a bubble when you're a preaching movement? That means you're going to go out into the world and the world's going to come to you. But even the Amish, who aren't a preaching movement, they can't make bubbles anymore. And it's really having a severe effect on them. Because their entire way of transmitting their culture was through a bubble and examples. That was what they did. And they can't keep their kids in the bubble anymore.
Really?
They can't. Global secular culture is such that nobody can run and hide from it. So like their philosophy, the whole reason the Amish came to America is their philosophy is that children cannot be baptized at birth. They have to make their own choice. They can be, but they have to be baptized again. They're called Anabaptists. That you have to make your own choice as an adult. You have to be at least 16. It's interesting, they also pick 16. That you have to be at least 16 before you can choose to be baptized. And it must be a choice. You must make a choice. So at 16, they say to the children, okay, now you can do whatever you want. So they keep them in a bubble until 16, and at 16 they said, now you can do whatever you want. And because the children have been in a bubble till 16, what happens is when they go do whatever they want, a lot of them get into real severe trouble. And a lot of problems with their kids becoming drug addicts and alcoholics and becoming criminals. Because they kept them in a bubble their whole youth, and as soon as they're exposed to the secular culture, they don't have to deal with it. And they're having problems with their youth they never had before. Previously, when they said to the kids at 16, okay, now you can do whatever you like, the possibilities of whatever you like were very limited. You follow me? The choices available for whatever you like category were limited. And that's not the case anymore. So they have it's a real serious problem. So my main point is examples not enough. Examples not enough. You cannot keep your kids in the bubble and just give them an example. They're going to see millions of different examples. And most of us don't even try to live in a bubble or want to live in a bubble, even think it's good to live in a bubble. But even if you thought it was good to live in a bubble, there's no bubbles anymore.
But Doesn't consistent example appeal to the children more than inconsistent?
Absolutely. But the problem is, no matter how wonderful your example is and how consistent your example is, there's other examples going on.
Right.
You can show a wonderful, consistent example. That is not going to be enough to transmit culture. It's important, and it helps, and you should do it. But if that's what you're relying on 100%, it will fail you. And you'll find your older generation of Indians, they're still in this example mode, that's all you need. All you need is to show a good example. It's not enough anymore. I'm not saying you shouldn't show a good example. I'm not saying that it's not important, and I'm not saying that you should be inconsistent. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's not enough. This isn't enough. So, going to the concept though, you did talk about observing and so forth, right? Someone talked about loving relationships. So our dealings with people are certainly still a very important way of learning culture. Now all of us not only are born imitators, children are natural imitators, but we also tend to try to please people who we love and who love us. And that's because ultimately we're meant to please Krishna. As souls, we are wired to try to please Krishna. There's one famous animal trainer and psychologist, Karen Pryor, who's written some excellent books. And she says that with very young animals and very young children, they will not respond to punishment. They just don't understand it. You cannot use punishment, she said, to train young animals or young children. Said when they're older, they'll do it, but not little. She said, but very little children and very young animals will respond to trying to please somebody who's taking care of them and who they love. And her conclusion was that we are wired much more to please than to obey. Which I thought was interesting because in our Hare Krishna movement, we don't talk much about the fear of God. You know, it's a real Christian thing, the fear of God. But we have it, it's in the Bhagavatam. Out of fear of the God, the wind blows, etc. But it's not our emphasis. We talk about love of God. And you'll see that in our own lives, we voluntarily mold ourselves to please people who love us and who we love. If there's somebody that we love and respect, we will mold ourselves to please that person. Now, we will even sometimes do that with people we don't know. We may even, you know, sometimes people do that with some movie star or rock star. They don't even know the person, but they have so much respect for the person, so much admiration for the person. But certainly people that we interact with. You know, and you could say that this is a system of punishment and reward, but it's on a very subtle emotional level. You know, if you think about it, the people that we really love and admire, what will they smile at, or what will they ignore, or what will they pay attention to? Those are the things that we try to do. And the example I always give in this regard is my father. That my father, from the time I was 2 until I went to college, he spent 2 hours with me every morning from about 5:15, 5:30 until he went to work or until I went to school when I was older. And he would play games with me and he would tell me stories and he would make my mother would sleep until 10. And my father would make my breakfast. He never cooked. I don't think my father ever cooked anything in his life. But he would, you know, get the cereal ready or he'd toast the bread and he would squeeze fresh orange juice and things like that. And because of that, I ended up with a very close relationship with him. And when I was 3, he said to me, "Don't ever smoke." Now, in those days, pretty much everybody smoked. And really, when I went to high school, like 90% of the kids in high school smoked. But I didn't smoke. And this was before the warnings on the cigarette packs, and it's hard for anybody to understand what it was like. You know, there were cigarette commercials on television and stuff like that. But why didn't I smoke? Because I wanted to please my father. It was important to me that my father was happy with me. Why? Because I had a sense that he loved me and he cared about me. And Prabhupada says, I think I have the quote there, said, why should a person follow their guru? Why would you put yourself under the control of another person? Because there's love and trust. Not compulsion. So this is what we talk about with peer pressure, or we talk about the concept of association. And we talk about, good association and bad association. That the people I want to please, I will change my values and I will change my behavior in order to please them and not displease them. I was talking to one devotee who's somewhat fallen from her practices, and in the course of the discussion she said, I really just want to be normal. She said, when people at work, want to go out to eat and they want to drink, I don't always want to be the one saying, oh, I don't drink, I don't drink, I don't drink. So we want to please and not displease those who we care about. Now, in addition to love and trust, we also want to please and displease people who have power over us out of fear. But when do we want to please and displease them? In what circumstances?
When you want something.
When we want something. But if someone has power over us, when do we change our behavior? No. If someone's more powerful than me, I may change my behavior to please and displease that person. Yes, but under what circumstances will I change my behavior?
When he's upset with us, or...
Okay, I don't want the person to be upset with me, but still, when? Under what time? What place? Yes, exactly. When the person is there, when they're watching. So if someone has power over me, I will change my behavior if they're there, if they can observe me. And if they're not, I go back to what I believe in. So dictatorships try to be always there. When a dictatorship tries to change a culture by force and by power, what they try to do is make themselves always there through spies. Right, the family, they'll get the family to inform on each other and get the neighbors to inform on each other. They try to make no time and place when a person can revert to their own beliefs. You understand? So we may think, again, that power and authority and having position will change people's values, but that's only true if you can be there all the time. And even then, sometimes after 20, 30 years, as soon as that power is gone, the person will revert. To what they actually believe in. But we will genuinely, on a deep level, change our values and behaviors for someone we love and someone we admire, because we genuinely want to please them. So this, of course, is the concept of guru. That's the whole basis of Krishna consciousness, and the idea of a society of love and trust. So if you have one person in your life who's a devotee of Krishna that you really have love and admiration and respect for, then that alone can be powerful enough for you yourself to want to act as a devotee. And if the people that you love and admire are materialistic people, then that can be enough to change your behavior that way. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So the first one is love and trust. Everybody say that? Love and trust.
Love and trust.
Okay. The second one was also mentioned. But we talked about how the global secular culture is spread through the media. So the media is made, of course, of stories. So it's interesting, the power of stories. If we think about, how culture is transmitted, is it transmitted just by direct instruction? Well, a little bit. But if I say to all of you, you should always be honest, are you inspired? Not really, right? Anybody here willing to say that they're perfectly 100% honest? Anybody? No, it's a problem, huh? So, but if I say that, okay, you have to be completely honest. It doesn't work, does it? And if I really get on your case, well, why are you ever dishonest? You should. All you're going to be is defensive. But if I I say, oh, there's a really nice story. There was this one boy who was taking care of the sheep. You know, and sheep are kind of boring. And every day he's just taking care of the sheep. And one day he said, I'm really bored. What can I do to get some excitement? You all know the story, right? No? No? So he was really bored, so he went into the village and he said, wolf, wolf, there's a wolf, there's a wolf. And the guys come running, you know, where's the wolf, where's the wolf? Oh, he was right over there. They look, they don't see any footprints or anything. You know. Oh, I guess he got away to go back to the village. And then the boy thought, oh, that was fun. I haven't had so much fun in a long time. You know, a couple months go by, again, sheep are really boring. And it'd be exciting to be a shepherd. So after a while, I thought, I'll try that again. That was funny. You know, so he runs into the town. Wolf, wolf! And they come up again. They're looking everywhere. No footprints. No sheep missing. You know. I don't know. He was there. He was there. You know, I saw him. I mean, maybe he went that way. Oh, okay. And the boy thought, oh, that was fun. And a few months later, and he found, I'm going to try it again, you know. And so again he goes in the village, wolf, wolf, and now only maybe half the people came. And again they didn't find any signs. He said, ah, it's quiet enough. Not reliable. And a week later there was a real wolf. He went in town and cried, wolf, wolf, and nobody came at all. So that's very interesting. When people listen to a story, always you'll find, as soon as people listen to a story, they become very attentive. If you're just talking theoretically, people are fidgeting. There's a story, people become attentive. And nobody felt, any of you feel defensive? Anybody feel defensive listening to that story? No, isn't that interesting? You all admitted that you're sometimes dishonest. I'm also sometimes dishonest. I haven't met anybody who said that they're completely honest all the time. So we all admitted that we're somewhat dishonest. And therefore you think a story about honesty would put us on the, but it doesn't. Because well, it's not about me, it's about a little boy and some sheep. You follow? And we like stories. Basically when we hear a story, we tell the defense part of our consciousness, oh relax, it's a story. It goes around the false ego. It's not hitting the false ego. And we all like stories because, of course, Krishna likes stories. He's constantly in stories. He has nothing to do. And yet he's always in stories. He's in stories, which are his Leela, and he likes to hear stories. You know, Mother Yasoda tells Krishna bedtime stories about witnessing a day. Every evening Krishna sees also dramas and reenactments of different stories of his incarnations. And if you look at the Shastra, it's all stories. The Bhagavatam is one big story of Sutta Goswami and the sages of Naimisharanya. And inside that there's another story of Maharaj Pariksit. And that's quite a story. You know, this great saint, and somehow he gets angry and puts this dead snake around the sage's neck. It's a whole story. And then there's another story, another story, another story. Psychologists have said, my father was a real important person. He got about 5 paragraphs in the New York Times. For his whole life. You know, in ISKCON, if you're really important, you'll get a whole article in BTG, 2,500 words. But even 2,500 words for everything you've done in your life. And you can try and experiment. Take somebody you really love, who really cares about you, and say, would you please sit down for 2 hours and listen to the details of everything I did today? You know, and try it. So materially, it's very, very hard to say you're doing something really meaningful. It's very difficult on a material level. On a material level, everything's a bunch of sandcastles. It just doesn't really have any meaning. Sorry. We don't even remember. We've done so many things in so many lives, and we don't remember, and we don't even really care. Even if you had some astrologer, they could tell you you did this and that. I mean, you get bored, frankly. Isn't it? But we have something that's real meaning. Serving Krishna is eternal and actually matters to Krishna. Krishna knows every single thing that we do for him and never forgets it. And has value eternally to God. So we have a great advantage that we can offer our children actually meaningful service. So how do we define something that's meaningful and when we feel fulfilled? It's where I'm doing something that really fits who I am and my nature for the service of a greater whole. And that's what we talk about, the perfection of Krishna consciousness. Perfection of Krishna consciousness is when I fully realize who I am. You know, you finally realize, oh, Krishna is one of Krishna's uncles, or I'm one of Krishna's friends, or I'm one of Krishna's gopis, or whatever, you know. And you realize what your name is, and what you're like, what your personality is, and what you do, what your unique characteristics are. And you use that in Krishna service. Isn't that correct, that that's the perfection? That's our philosophy, yes? Everybody agree with that? Yes? You're sleeping?
Yes.
You agree? Yes, okay, good.
Yes.
So even in this life, that's our idea of perfection in this life, that I realize what kind of nature do I have, what talents and abilities do I have in this life, and I use that for Krishna, even though that's not my eternal identity. And materially even, that's how people feel most fulfilled, is doing something that's their nature for the service of something greater. One very famous, I don't know what category you put him in, sociologist perhaps, Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote about this thing called flow, where you feel just that you can do something forever, you don't want to stop. Your work becomes, there's no distinction between work and play. Where you feel, I'm in my place, I'm where I belong. So anytime we experience that, we are going to want to be in a circumstance where we can experience that again. It's a very pleasurable thing for us. To really be who I am and what I am, and be doing who I am and what I am in the service of a greater whole. So any society or organization that can provide that for someone, that person will want to be a member of that society. So of course, Srila Prabhupada asked us to do that in our ISKCON society, to engage everybody according to their propensities. He said, be careful not to kill the spirit of enthusiastic service, which is individual, spontaneous, and voluntary. So that is really the essence of our Krishna consciousness. Now, in traditional societies, children were engaged in meaningful service from a very young age. Like when Prabhupada asked Urmila to make some dough, and and she was asking him questions, and he said, in India, any 5-year-old girl knows how to make dough. So in our modern society, basically because of industrialization and children being forced to work in factories, we don't do that anymore. So we now have that children can go until they're 25 before they do anything meaningful. Isn't it? And we even discourage them. When I've given this seminar, some people tell me, well, I can't have my kid do anything meaningful because they have to concentrate on their studies. Well, how old are they? 22. And we have this concept that until you've finished all your education, at least your bachelor's, maybe your master's, maybe 2 PhDs or whatever, you're not supposed to do anything meaningful in the world. Isn't this? Just study, 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 study. I mean, you can, but we certainly don't expect it. But this urge to do meaningful service is there even in a very young child. Very, very young children imitate their parents, and they try to do things that are meaningful, yes? It's funny, we kind of train this out of them, so that often the 4-year-old child is more helpful than the 14-year-old child. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. But that's due to bad training, because it's natural for the living entity to take pleasure in meaningful service. And Srila Prabhupada encouraged that. He said the children should, as far as possible, do whatever, I think that's one of the quotes you have there, what the elders are doing. So this means a society where we make plans to engage the children in meaningful service. It should be service where they're learning something, where they're gaining some skills. It should be service where they get to develop and discover their propensities and their talents, and then use their propensities and their talents in service. And it should be service where they're treated with respect. So sometimes that means it has to be adults other than the parents who engage them, because often parents will still treat their children like children even when the children are 40 years old. What it is, the nature of parents. So I'd say that at least by 14, are we having a problem here at the time? Can we go on?
Yes, yes.
So I'd say at least by 14, at the latest, children should be doing meaningful service, preferably by 11, and you could even do it by 5 or 6.
Can you give me an example of service that a child could do?
Gosh, you should have been. Don't you remember in Nugo Loco we used to have the kids go and like help make Gewicks and.
Yeah.
Or I remember. Oh, thank you. I remember my own kids from a young age were designing things like doing layout and design. They were helping to teach. It really helps when you have home-based businesses for this kind of thing, because then naturally you need help and your kids are around, so you ask them.
Chores, like you cut vegetables or.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. But like all 3 of my kids learned how to teach, because we had a school in our house. And because my husband had a computer business in the house, at least both of my boys learned how to program. They learned how to build computers. They learned how to repair computers. They both learned how to do accounting. And because my husband ran his own business and I was running a school, all 3 of my kids learned how to do management and leadership. So the boys had computer skills by the time they were, you know, like 16, 17, that were better than people who had bachelor's and master's in computer science. Literally. So. And my youngest son was second level manager in an international company, I think by the time he was like 22.
Did they connect to that with Krishna? Like they
Very much so.
understood its devotional services?
Well, when they were young, yes. And even when they were doing things, you know, outside as a job or whatever, they were very proud of the fact that they had learned that in devotional service. You know, like they would say to me, or people will say, where did you go to school? And they'd say, oh, I went to ISKCON. Because they had a lot more abilities and training than anybody would get outside. So the third one is meaningful service. So we have, what are they now?
And meaningful services.
I know a lot of people guess these when we talk about, you know, how we learn culture. But it's very, very rare that I find anybody who knows about the fourth one. And this is interesting because this fourth one is something that all of us have experienced in our lives. It's part of our lives. We know about it. But my guess is that we have hardly ever thought about it. What to speak of purposely used it. So I'd like to ask, how many of you here have a certain smell that when you smell that thing, it brings out an emotional response in you? Some certain smell. Okay, almost everybody has a smell. Certain kind of food, particular kind of food, that engenders an emotional response. What about a certain piece of music? And you have a certain piece of music. Okay, certain place. Certain kind of activity, certain person, okay? Sometimes it can be certain times of the day. So almost everybody has a smell. Smell is the most powerful emotional, of all the senses it evokes, most likely to evoke a memory and emotional response. So these things are called, in psychology, triggers. Sometimes they're called anchors. What a trigger is it's a specific sensory input that triggers an immediate emotional response, either positive or negative. It's not just that it gives you a memory, it gives you a feeling. It's not that you go, oh, I remember that. So it can also be a place. Just like I lived here many years ago, and I was walking upstairs, and it was being there triggered feelings in me. Does that, everybody follow this? So these triggers can be created in one of two ways. They can be created through repeated weak experiences or through one strong experiences. And again, these can be positive or negative. They can be positive or negative. Repeated weak experiences or one strong experience. So I gave the example earlier of my father. That with my father every day, we would spend 2 hours together in the morning. So that was a repeated week experience. And what that ended up creating for me was a positive trigger for the early morning. It took me a long time to even understand that. I didn't even know that. I just knew that I loved the early morning. And I just thought I loved the early morning because everybody loved the early morning. It was wonderful. It was actually maybe about 10, 15 years ago. I remember talking to one of my students who really didn't like the early morning. He said, I hate getting up in the morning. I couldn't fathom it. It was like, somebody hates getting up. And then I was really thinking about it. Why do I like getting up early? And then I realized, oh, because I emotionally associate that time with being with my father. Right? Or I had a couple years when I was young that I was taking this really horrible medicine and it was flavored with cardamom. And I don't like cardamom. You understand? That was a repeated week experience. I'd associate the taste of cardamom with this medicine. Or you want to think of a strong experience. So for 10 years we lived in Detroit, which is right by Windsor, Canada. There was a big Indian community in Windsor, so there were Indian grocery stores. We would do our grocery shopping there. And one day, I said, I'm going to go to Windsor and buy some rice and stuff. And my daughter said, I think she was about 6 or 7 at the time. She said, oh, Mommy, can I go with you? I said, sure. So we went into Canada, and then when we got to the shop, she said, oh, I don't want to come in. Can I wait in the car? I said, yeah, I'm going to be 5 minutes. So when I came back to the car, she was hiding under the dashboard. And I said, what's going on? She said, Mother, there was some man in the parking lot, and he looked like one of those men that steal, kidnap little girls, and it was so scary. And she told me for years after that, if she heard the name Canada, she would feel fear. Or I also had, for many, many years, I would always like to go get the mail. We had a house that had a long driveway to the mailbox. And at one point my kids said to me, Mom, why do you always like to get the mail? Then I realized that when we were building our school, that one time I went down to get the mail, and at the mailbox, I opened up an envelope that had a check inside for $35,000. I was standing in the mailbox when I opened it up. That's why I like to go get the mail. So repeated weak experiences or one strong experience. And they can be positive or negative. So again, a trigger is a sensory experience. So when you look at the senses, it's going to be a smell, a particular piece of music, a particular flavor of food, a particular place, it can be a particular activity, it can be a certain time, it can be a certain person's face. Okay? That triggers either a positive or negative emotional response. And if it's a positive response, it's something that we want to do it over and over again, hoping we'll get that experience again, basically. And if it's a negative one, then we'll avoid that. So one thing that's very significant is, are we creating positive or negative emotional situations in association with Krishna conscious practices? So like I know one girl who was raised in devotional service, and she loves Krishna, she loves kirtan, but she just won't chant japa because she was often punished during japa time. She said, I can't touch the beads. So the beads became for her a negative trigger. Does that make sense to everybody? So we should consider, are we having positive emotional experiences in connection with our basic practices of Krishna consciousness? So this would mean coming to the temple. How are the children treated when they come to the temple? It can be the temple area in our room, in our house, the time of the day that we do our devotional practices, the practices themselves. Are we creating positive emotional experiences? So if it's like, okay, you have to study Bhagavad Gita, this is good for you, you know, then you may be creating a negative trigger. So the fourth one is positive emotional experiences. So we can go through again. They are
love and trust, stories, meaningful engagement,
Meaningful service, and positive emotional. So these are the ways in which culture is transmitted. You can notice that every culture does this kind of thing. A lot of the idea of festivals and celebrations are to create positive triggers. A lot of like the national holidays and things are to then create for those people positive triggers in relationship with their country. You know, doing things together as a family. If the family sits down and has wonderful, happy meals together every day, that creates a positive emotional trigger with the concept of family. That makes sense to me. You associate being with your family with eating good food and joking and having fun and like that. Okay, any questions on anything? I'm not going to take too many questions since we've been sitting for a long time. We talked about a lot of things. We have a broad range, much broader than I anticipated. Yes?
I really like the fourth one, the triggers. I've also heard that child, like in the early years, they're in touch with their bodies. They are aware of what's happening. They're honest. They tell what they feel, so I feel angry, and they express it. But oftentimes, because culturally, or some other commitments wise, may not be paying attention to that, right? The emotions that come up, so how do we deal with the balance between paying attention or giving the positive triggers versus because the opportunities are less in this time and age where we get for the child to experience something at the same time paying attention to what they are saying and what their needs are, what their
if I understand you correctly, then what you're talking about is kind of another topic. But I'm thinking more like during the time that you have kirtan with your children, during the time you take them to the temple, when you're doing things that are Krishna conscious with them, to be aware and alert of what is the emotional environment. Are you also creating a positive emotional environment? I used to think that the most important thing was creating good habits. And who cared what emotions were connected with them or not. That if you had good habits, you would continue to do them. But if you had a habit that was often associated with a negative emotion, then you may be guaranteeing that your kid's not going to do it. So that's what I'm talking about, rather than being sensitive and aware of the kid's emotions and needs, which is an important discussion, but that's not what I'm talking about right now, and I don't have the time right now to discuss it, but that is a very important discussion. Yes?
So then is it essentially sort of 5 things because we've premised with the fact that setting an example is important, but is not enough?
I would say that setting an example is part of the love and trust. That if I have a loving, trusting, if I trust somebody, if I admire them and I trust them, then I will want to follow their example and I will want to do things that please them. I will want to follow both their example and even their teachings, even if their teachings contradict their example. So even if they're smoking and they say, look, I'm smoking, but please, please, please don't smoke. Then I'll even follow that. But I'm likely to follow the example and or the request and the teaching of people that I love and trust. Rather than I'm likely to follow the example of people just because I happen to be around me and just because I happen to be my authorities. So the concept that all I need to do is set an example and I don't need to have a loving relationship is just not true anymore. It used to be. It used to be. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that parents didn't really think it was important to have loving relationships with their children. Again, this may seem very odd to us today. My mother's parents never once said, I love you to her. Never. Her whole upbringing. And that wasn't a peculiarity of her parents. It wasn't that her parents have some sort of psychological problem. That was the way it was in the world. People didn't think that was important. They didn't. And as far as transmitting culture, it wasn't. Your children were likely to follow your culture because that was all they knew. If you didn't find out, that if the only way you were going to find out that there were other cultures was by traveling, and most people didn't travel. You know, go back before the automobile. And how much traveling do people do? Not much. The kind of interaction that we have now between people all over the world is, it just didn't exist. I mean, you remember when the internet didn't exist. You know, pre-internet, if you wanted to find out something, you had to drive to a library. Yes. And it might be you lived in a small town with a small library. Maybe they didn't have anything on the topic. When at 8 years old I was interested in reincarnation, all I had was an entry in my encyclopedia. It's not like now, I can go on the internet and do a search for reincarnation and find out all kinds of things. I can see probably 10 movies about it, right? Just in my own room. So example without a loving relationship isn't going to be enough anymore. It's something. It's something. But it's not enough. Why should I follow the example of my parents just because they're my parents? I might, I might not. I'm much more likely to follow the example of someone who I love and admire. But you didn't need to love and admire your parents 100 years ago to follow their example. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Even if your parents had a very distant and cold emotional relationship with you, you probably follow their example anyway because that was your world. Your parents were doing that, your aunties and your uncles and your grandparents and everybody else in your community. And if anybody didn't follow that example, then they were socially shunned to some extent. And you didn't know that there was somebody thousands of miles away who did something different. You didn't even know it existed. How are you going to do something you don't know it existed? And part of the reason that people have so many different, we'll call it lifestyle choices today, is that they know that those choices exist. Does that make sense? People are thinking, can I do this, can I do that, can I do this, can I want to live like this way, do I want to live like this way? I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just simply making a neutral observation.
But then, what about when, like, these are all really strong tools to develop a stronger Krishna consciousness strongly, and so I guess when these other influences come in, which they inevitably will, the idea is that Krishna consciousness will be the stronger influence.
That's the hope. But you should also be aware, if the child's main relationships of love and trust is with people who are atheistic, then that may trump it. Because these are all very, very powerful things. If the child's, especially when they're very, very young, because a lot of this stuff forms at this age, on an unconscious level, we don't even remember it being formed. You know, if the young child is always listening to stories of materialists, you know, when we did our Learn to Read, that's what I wanted to show you guys, our Learn to Read. When we did our Learn to Read, I was looking at reading programs, you know, from all different publishers. And the thing that struck me was there was no God. I mean, I was looking at English-speaking countries, America, England, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. There's no God. It was just gone. So if the kids are reading books where there's no God, and they're seeing, you know, movies where there's no God, where God is irrelevant, the only people who worship God are a little weird. Or the only people who worship God are people who lived hundreds of years ago. then that's going to influence them. So it's both. It's both having these things in Krishna consciousness and watching how they're operating outside of Krishna consciousness. If the children don't find any meaningful service in the Hare Krishna movement, but they find meaningful service in some materialistic endeavor. That's what you said to me last night, where they were worshiping the military. That's where they found meaningful service. You know, if someone's a kshatriya, we don't offer very many kshatriya opportunities in the Hare Krishna movement. And if somebody finds, well, I don't have a place in the Hare, I don't have a place in the movement where I can use my talents and my abilities and my personality, and they find that kind of place outside, then that may trump whatever we're giving. And if they have deeply positive emotional experiences at nightclubs, and they come to the temple, and people say, you know, get out of here, we don't want the children here, you know, what use are you? So it's where we find those things that we're going to go there. You know, we are going to go back over and over again to the places where we have positive emotional experiences. We are. And we're going to avoid the places and activities where we have negative emotional experiences. I mean, we just are. And we're going to put ourselves in communities where we can find meaningful service, and we'll avoid being in communities and societies where we don't find meaningful service. And we'll try to please those that we love and trust, no matter who they are. And we will become the kind of people that we read, hear, and watch in stories. So it's being aware of what your children are being exposed to in those areas in other cultures, and being aware of what we have to offer them. Have you all seen our retreat already? Has everybody already seen it?
No, that's it.
So this is I don't carry the whole thing with me. It's 83 books, weighs about 25 pounds. It's altogether about this big. So I just carry a small sample with me. But these are books to teach how to read. And if you start at the earliest book, and you go through to the latest book, then they're scientifically designed to teach reading. And they're designed according to 4 international systems of teaching reading, 2 British systems, 1 American system, 1 New Zealand system. Interestingly, it's the New Zealand system that's the main international standard. And these were developed with 2 of the top 5 reading experts in the world. So they follow scientific principles of teaching reading in a very gradual step. And there's stories of Krishna's pastimes, there's stories from the Shastra. You can pass this one around. I do want these back, please. There are stories about our family living in rural India. And they would go over down. So there's a number of series in here, because children like series where they can read about the same people over and over again. And here's stories about a family living in a modern city. Then every one of the color books has a black and white book to go with it. So this is instructions for the parents or the teachers. And again, it's all kinds of activities. This is really the heart of the program as an educational resource.
So this is for children like 5 through 7? Sort of?
If I was going to use it in a school, yes, it would be used for age 5 through 7. It can be used starting as young as 4 as a learning resource. As just fun books, you could use it as young as 1 or 2, and as old as probably 8 or 10. So this is a little higher level one. It also has a lot of additional stories. So cake is nice. No, I'm not showing you them. I'm going to do something. So cake is nice, right? Everybody likes cake, right? But cake with icing is even better, yes?
Krishna and Yashoda sat on a mat. Krishna, now Yashoda said,
I'm Krishna's mother, Yashoda.
I'm baby Krishna.
So that's not all.
I look for my Krishna. Krishna calls me tonight in the light of the moon, Radha said.
चांदनी कृष्ण मुझे बुला रहा है, राधा ने कहा।
રાધાએ કહ્યું, ચાંદની રાતના આજે કૃષ્ણ મને બોલાવે છે.
నేను నా కృష్ణుడి కోసం ఎదురు చూస్తున్నాను. ఈ రాత్రి వెన్నెల్లో నన్ను కృష్ణుడు పిలుస్తాను అని రాధ చెప్పింది.
રાધા બોલ્યો, આજ રાતે ચાલી રાતોએ કૃષ્ણ અમાકે ડાકશે.
I had someone come up to me about the address and say, I love your books, my boy is learning how to read and I'm learning Bengali.
என் நிலவொளியில் வருமாறு கிருஷ்ணன் என்னை அழைக்கிறார் என ராதை கூறினார்.
ರಾಧೆ ಹೇಳಿದಳು, ಕೃಷ್ಣನು ಹುಣ್ಣಿಮೆಯ ಈ ರಾತ್ರಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಕರೆಯುತ್ತಿದ್ದಾನೆ.
And what else would you like?
今晚在月光中 Krishna 呼唤我，鲁阿婆说。
Этим вечером Кришна зовет меня в свете луны, сказала Радха.
Any other language you'd like to hear?
Chinese?
I did Chinese.
We did Chinese.
Krishna me llama esta noche a la luz de la luna, dijo Radha.
We're not going to end up using that. We only have about 100 of these books left. And when they're sold out, the publisher's not going to reprint them. So at this point, the publisher is just doing them as apps. So right now we have just 3 apps for the iPad. I'll just Did Krishna Do It. We have Did Krishna Do It in English and Hindi and Gujarati for the iPad. We've got somebody working on Android apps. If we do reprint them, it'll probably be in India without the audio. So we had an idea that somebody could also do additional languages, but it never happened. So the pictures, of course, they're in English.
I'm Krishna's footprint. Follow me.
So we also have a lot of songs.
Dear Dasi, where is Krishna? Dear Kadambra, where is Krishna?
You can't find me.
I think I can hear his flute.
Again, I want this back.
So how can we order them?
You can get them only online.
Krishna's garden smells so sweet. I wonder if there is any honey in it. We like to sing along with Krishna's flute song.
Making music with birds is so much fun.
Then you can also record your own voices into the books.
Record.
I like playing my flute with the birds,
I love playing my flute with the birds.
and that doesn't override the original recording. So as I said, there's only about 100 books. There's only about 100 left.
You meant 100 sets of this?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, okay.
And the publisher is just trying to liquidate the stock at this point, and he's going to apps. So you can get them at Krishna.com, you can get them from Bhaktivedanta Library Services, or you can get them from the publisher if you go to illuminationeducation.com. And right now they're on sale for 20 British pounds a box. There's 3 boxes. And then the pen is separate. We're also offering them at a sale. I don't want to put it on the recorder. We're also putting them on as a sale, so I can give you a code that you can put in and you can get them for only 12 pounds a box instead of 20. So we're going to make that available to the general public probably in about a month if there's still any left. But right now, no, each box, there's 3 boxes. There's A, B, and C boxes. And with each box, with the code, you can get the box for 12 pounds. Then the pen is extra. The pen is, I think, 45 pounds. And then there's the app if you have an iPad or...
For all of the books?
Each box has, is it 14 color books and 14 black and white books?
Okay.
So each box is 12 pounds, 12 British pounds.
Okay.
It's probably about somewhere around $18 to $20.
Okay.
And then the pen is like 45 pounds. That's separate. And then there's shipping. So that's if you go to, also on illuminationeducation.com, there is a section that says downloads. And in the download section, there's, it says free Hare Krishna ebooks. So we have a lot of free stuff there. Which, so it's different. Okay, if you can give those back, please. If you want the code for the discount, just ask me. I don't want to run recorders. Just ask me and I can give you the code.